Omar's destiny is to lead the Taliban, a powerful movement to bring stability to a country ripped apart by war. But instead of the Islamic utopia Omar envisions, the Taliban will turn Afghanistan into the world's worst humanitarian disaster.
It was very hard to control yourself to do not cry. They were beating people always. Every single tree was burned. Every single house.
It's hard for many Afghans to remember a time without fighting. But it wasn't always like this. Afghanistan once knew peace. And that's where this tumultuous story begins. It's 1973, and King Zahir Shah rules the country as a modern democracy with free elections, women's rights, and strong international relationships. But later that year, the prosperity starts to unravel. Massive political upheaval is about to set Afghanistan on a ruinous path. First, King Zahir Shah falls in a power struggle and is banished to exile in Rome. Over the next 6 years, new leaders come and go, and Afghanistan's inner turmoil helps make it an inviting target for the most powerful force in the region, the Soviet Union. In 1979, Soviet leaders are seized by Cold War paranoia. The Kremlin fears that the United States could use Afghanistan to threaten the Soviet mainland, according to this former CIA officer.
They had a gross misreading of our intentions and thought that we were going to move into Afghanistan and even place medium-range missiles. KGB reporting was grotesquely off target.
But Soviet Prime Minister Leonid Brezhnev decides that the communists can't afford to lose Afghanistan. In mid-December 1979, Soviet troops start to mobilize for a major operation. Early on Christmas morning, the first Soviet tanks roll across the border of Afghanistan. This imposing terrain has humbled some of history's greatest armies. But the Soviet Union arrives here with all the arrogance befitting a 20th century nuclear-armed superpower.
Since 1979, the Soviet Union, in violation of every convention protecting the rights of a sovereign nation, has tried to impose its will on the people of Afghanistan. Despite the death and destruction brought by the Soviets, the Afghan struggle for freedom continues. The Afghan government, who, like others in this report, cannot be identified in order to protect their family and friends, recalls the early days of Soviet aid to his country.
Initially, people found some advantages in these assistance programs. Some areas were developed, roads were made, and some factories were constructed. But after almost 2 or 3 decades, we found out that Russians had bad intentions right from the very beginning. Apparently, it was aid and assistance, but in reality, it was a program of exploitation. They exploited the country economically. And we found their ill intention when the military coup of 1978 took place. This was the time that we found they wanted to change the country to a communist country, to a country which apparently would be a free country, but in reality it would be one of their satellites, a country which would literally follow their instructions and their behavior. The oppression of this regime and the way they were killing the people, the way they were imprisoning the people, persecuting the people, and torturing the people, all showed that all these things were planned. As a result, people could not tolerate this, and resistance started in different parts. Resistance was local, and initially it was wiped out quickly by the government forces. But people did not give up, and they continued to resist. These resistance pockets grew, and finally,
Afghanistan will end up as a Soviet satellite.
I think initially there was very few people in the American government who didn't believe that the Russians would ultimately prevail, because they had modern guns, because there were so many of them, and because they were brutal.
Within months, the Soviets occupy most of the major cities. But getting into Afghanistan has always been the easy part. It's holding on to the country that has proven historically difficult. For centuries, the Afghan people have resisted occupying forces, from the Greek armies of Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan's Mongols and the imperialist British Empire.
One of the earliest names for Afghanistan is Yagistan. It's called the land of the unruly.
The Afghans are not people you can control or order to do anything.
They do have a strong warrior culture. They do have a strong warrior history.
3 years into the Soviet occupation, the Red Army still can't completely stamp out the resistance. Now, U.S. intelligence officers start to reconsider their opinion of the Afghan Mujahideen.
We began to appreciate the qualities of the Afghans, their ability to absorb punishment, the strength of their faith, their ingenuity in designing ways to kill the Russians. If we armed these people, they would continue to fight the Russians forever.
The war in Afghanistan has the potential to weaken the Soviet Union both militarily and economically. The CIA looks at the Afghans' fierce Islamic passion and sees a dagger that only needs sharpening. Then, the Mujahideen can make the Soviets bleed. New U.S. President Ronald Reagan decides to intensify a covert CIA program, first begun under Jimmy Carter. America will secretly support the Afghan rebels.
The Congress was virtually united in giving whatever aid they could to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, partly because of the feeling that the Russians were a Goliath kicking in the head of a David, but also because a lot of them wanted revenge for what happened in Vietnam.
In Vietnam, Moscow supported America's adversary, the North Vietnamese. Now the CIA hopes to give the Soviets a long drawn-out guerrilla conflict of its own, but they'll have to do it quietly. An overt confrontation could trigger World War III. To disguise U.S. involvement, the secret program requires the cooperation of several Islamic countries sympathetic to the Afghan Jihad, or Holy War. Saudi Arabia agrees to help put up the money, and Pakistan accepts the job of getting the cash and guns into the hands of the Afghans. Pakistani General Hamid Gul will be the gatekeeper through which U.S. arms and money must pass on their way into Afghanistan. Today, Gul is a militant Islamist who has publicly called for Muslims to attack American troops wherever they are deployed. But during the 1980s, he was eager to help the United States fight the Soviets.
The Red Menace had to be defeated. It was a daunting task. Pakistan took up the challenge.
Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI, will transfer ever-increasing amounts of American money and sophisticated weaponry over the legendary Khyber Pass and into the hands of the Mujahideen. U.S. spending on the CIA's Afghan program grows from $30 million in 1981 to $200 million by 1984, with Saudi Arabia matching every dollar. Soon the Afghan resistance is doing better than CIA officers ever thought possible. Mujahideen warriors have killed or wounded an estimated 17,000 Soviet soldiers. Victor Munayan was a Red Army medic who saw many of his fellow soldiers return from the battlefield in body bags.
Some were captured. We would recover pieces of soldiers. Only with the pieces could we identify who it was.
The ferocity of the Afghan resistance now forces the Soviets to consider quadrupling their troop deployment. But the Afghans are getting reinforcements too. Thousands of Islamic volunteers from all over the world are arriving in Pakistan to join the jihad. Among the volunteers is a wealthy young Saudi named Osama bin Laden.
Throughout Afghanistan, Soviet aircraft were now bombing indiscriminately. They pummeled village after village into oblivion. In a typical attack on April the 8th, 1985, the villages of Kutz and Mindrawar on the Kabul-Jalalabad highway were bombed, then overrun by Soviet troops.
The Soviets destroyed the whole village. It's impossible to count how many they killed. The men were dragged out of their houses and sent off to the Afghan army. Those who refused were taken aside and gunned down, butchered.
The Russians took 14 of us and made us stand in a line near this wall. 2 Russian soldiers stood in front of us with machine guns. We began reciting the Holy Kalima from the Holy Quran because we knew we were about to die. They machine-gunned every one of us. I fell. There was a pile of bodies all on top of me. The bullets missed me. The soldiers searched us and took our money. They moved me, but I just pretended to be dead.
The rockets were falling all around us like leaves off a tree. My daughter's head was smashed open. Her brains were hanging from a branch. I lost everything. My cousins, my nephews, everybody was killed. My wife, my 4 children.
There was no such thing as a peaceful population. They were all guerrilla fighters. I remember how we once rounded up all the women and children, poured kerosene over them and set fire to them. Yes, it was cruel. Yes, we did it. But those kids were torturing our wounded soldiers with knives.
When you kill, you don't feel calm, you just feel indifferent. You're paranoid, you lose your morality. You become very cold-blooded. Your soul grows cold because you're confronted with something you don't like doing.
A young soldier might kill just to test his gun. Or if he's curious to see what the inside of a human being looks like.